Hi, welcome to Deep Into Sleep podcast. I'm your host, Yishan. Hopefully, you all have a great start of the year. As you may know, if you've been listening to my podcast, I took a 2-week break from podcasting and clinical work to really try to do self-care and get myself recharged for the new year. So for the past 2 weeks, our podcast replayed some classic episode I had with Dr. Barwick and Dr. Winter. Hopefully you enjoyed them. So now I'm back, fully recharged and ready for the new year. So today we will talk about the discrepancy within sleep perception. You may have this experience. Sometimes we slept the whole night. In the morning, we thought we slept poorly. But if we were to measure our sleep using some kind of device, the reality may be we slept pretty well, but we think we slept poorly. Why there's such gap? So today we have our guest, Dr. Spencer Dunson from Better Sleep Bloomington. He is a clinical psychologist specializing in behavioral sleep medicine, and he has done a lot of great research in this area. So let's hear from him together why this kind of gap exists and what we can do about it. Hey, Dr. Dunson, welcome to Deep Into Sleep.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'm really excited to have you today because I know you've been in the field of behavioral sleep medicine for quite a while and did a lot of great research and clinical work in this field.
Yeah.
Do you want to introduce yourself to our audience, just in case some audience don't know you very much?
Sure, yeah. So, I guess I might start by just saying that I got my start in the field of sleep research working as a research assistant. I didn't know anything about sleep. I ended up working at a sleep lab at University of Michigan for about 4 years. Did my PhD at University of Arizona with Dick Bootson, and then postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University, working mostly with Dr. Jason Ong. And now I am in independent practice in Bloomington, Indiana.
Cool. So what got you into this field originally? Did you carry a certain questions you want to answer about sleep, or you just step into it without knowing, without having an idea?
Yeah. So the way I got connected with the very first sleep I worked with was that I knew that I loved research. I knew that I loved psychology. I had graduated college and just started applying for research jobs anywhere that was hiring. So the first place to call me back was a sleep lab, and ended up being a terrific fit. Really a lot of fun. I knew I loved research and always had it in my head that I would go to graduate school. And sure enough, I did. But not surprisingly, spending nights watching people sleep, monitoring their brain activity, talking to them in the morning. One of the things that was really interesting to me was a lot of times what I saw and what people told me didn't match up.
Ah.
I even had an experience where people are on sleep schedules. They're okay, this is the time that you go to bed. And so we would wire people up, and sometimes there would be a little bit of time before lights out. And I just remember a case where I looked over at the screen, and this one of the participants in our research study looked like he was he was sleeping. He was in stage 2 for sure. I went over to the room and said, "It's not time to fall asleep yet." And he was like, "I wasn't asleep." I was like, And then, also seeing folks taking, a normal amount of time to fall asleep. That was always kind of a thing. If you're the tech running the study, once people actually fall asleep and actually really fall asleep, then you can kind of relax a little bit and realize, okay, they're probably not, they're probably doing fine. They don't need anything from me. They're just sleeping. And then you can kind of relax a little bit. So you're always kind of paying attention to that to an extent. So having folks fall asleep in kind of a normal amount of time, and in the morning, one of the standard questions is, how long did it take for you to fall asleep? And somebody might say, really long time. And we never really even discussed it, just collecting the information at that point. But that really kind of got, those experiences really got me thinking, okay, what is going on here? What is going on with this mismatch? And that's what really led me. That was a question that hooked with me to my graduate school experience, and ended up exploring there.
That's very interesting. So this actually is something not only you observe. I don't work in the sleep lab, but I also observe quite a lot. So I've also carried this question too. Why? Because I heard a lot of people, they are actually sleeping, but they think they are not. So a lot of people complain, well, I have insomnia. I haven't slept for days. But if you really have some kind of tracker or they sleep in a sleep lab, they are actually sleeping 5 or 6 or even more hours. Does not match what they think they are getting, right? So why people are doing that? Why that is happening?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And the answer is pretty complicated, really. And it kind of, somebody might say, oh, I haven't slept for days or for weeks. And that would just sort of, you would think, oh, well, if somebody told me they hadn't thing to eat or drink for days or weeks, I would like, well, you would be dead.
Right.
And if you really hadn't slept at all for days or, well, probably, yeah, for days or weeks, you would really be suffering. You would be really in ill health and just really dragging. And, if you talk to somebody a little bit more, they'll tell you that, oh, well, I got, a couple, a little bit, or I was in and out, or didn't feel like I was getting real sleep. So that initial I haven't slept is usually there's a little bit more there. And as you kind of continue kind of delving in, a lot of times folks will tell you a little bit more about how they're actually getting some sleep, but it's just really bad or something along those lines. But that's just kind of in conversation with somebody in kind of, sort of a clinical interview or that sort of situation. But some of the research that's been done, and a lot of it's stuff that was done like the 70s and 80s and since then as well. But stuff that's pretty early on when people were really kind of trying to get at this question of what's going on with people kind of not knowing if they're awake or asleep was done where they would bring people into the lab and see, wake them up or just wake them up when they were already awake. Kind of go through the same procedure and ask, when I just called you over the intercom, for example, were you awake or asleep? And folks with insomnia are more likely to say that I was awake, even if maybe they didn't respond until the second or third time that they were called. So even the behavioral response is like you were asleep. The EEG looked like you were asleep, but then you ask the person, and their experience in that moment is I was awake. So that's kind of another piece that's sort of interesting. And I think what the way to frame this phenomenon is, which is not the most popular term, it's a little bit newer term, is sleep discrepancy. So there's a discrepancy between two different measurements. So it's not that one is wrong and one is right, but rather that there's a difference, and that difference tells us something. When things don't match up, it's for a reason. Part of that can be, being very distressed and kind of communicating that. You say, things are really terrible. And sort of that example I was giving before, I haven't slept for days or weeks, but you can get a little bit of sleep. It can be also sort of hindsight bias, where, you kind of think back over the last month and how were you sleeping? I was sleeping terrible, but then you give somebody a sleep diary and they're tracking it every night, and you find that they have some better nights in there. Maybe things aren't, perfect and the way they want them to be, especially at the beginning of treatment, but it's better than perhaps, kind of when you're forced to think backwards, what was that like? And it's when you're already feeling badly, it's hard to remember the good stuff. But then yet another piece is that looks like there is increased brain activity in folks with insomnia while they're asleep. There's some really nice studies of this. Some just analyzing the EEG and seeing more high frequency activity, which often tends to reflect, sort of ongoing cognitive activity. So you might still have some amount of consciousness that's persisting into sleep. And then there was a group at Pitt that did PET imaging. I don't know if you're familiar with those studies. I think Eric Knopfsinger headed up that project, and it's pretty amazing that people sleeping in the lab with a catheter, like an IV in, and once they were asleep and in stable stage 2 sleep, they injected them with a radio tracer that then would uptake into areas that were more active in the brain. It was a radio labeled glucose. So parts of your brain that are more active or using more glucose, and then the glucose that's radio labeled goes there, and then they wake them up, take them over the PET scanner, and you can see while they were asleep, that's when the uptake happened. Now they're awake, it doesn't really matter. You just see where that glucose had gone when they were asleep, and seeing that where was increased metabolic activity in the frontal cortex, and also in nodes of the default mode network, which is related with self-referential processing. So showing that indeed the folks who had insomnia, especially the folks who had more of that discrepancy, actually their brains were more active during sleep. So they're not wrong. And so I think that's kind of one of the kind of getting on the same page. It's not about being right or wrong. So there's a difference, but it's also something that can be improved. That's kind of one of the other nice things is even folks who have a bit of discrepancy, they can respond to treatment, and they can get better sleep.
Yeah, that's very important, I think, for people to know and understand. It sounds like there are quite a lot going on in our body, in our brain while we are sleeping. And no matter whether we have insomnia or not, but if we do have insomnia, possibly there's more stuff going on. But still, sounds like part of that is people don't quite understand what is normal sleep, what is right, what is not right. There's a lot of interpretations. I know a lot of Asian clients I see, they would say, well, I'm not quite in deep sleep. If I remember my dream, if, I feel like I'm in and out, I'm not quite sure, am I really sleeping or awake? I think I'm sleeping poorly because it's not so-called deep sleep. They feel like they're supposed to have this deep sleep without noticing anything the whole night. So I think there are a lot of ideas like that people carry.
Yeah, for sure. And I hear that a lot from clients. Like when you talk to them a little bit more, I'm not sure, I was in and out. When you're in and out, it feels like the whole time was being awake. I mean, that's pretty normal. And then, some people feel like, if I remember nothing, that was deep sleep. Other people who talk to them, it's like, oh, well, I would know I was sleeping well if I remembered my dreams. I'm not dreaming. But dream recall is pretty variable. I mean, not everybody remembers their dreams. It kind of depends on what stage of sleep you wake up out of and that sort of thing. So with the dreaming thing, the ideas that people come to can really be kind of all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when people ask you those questions, how do you answer them? And do they buy in what you tell them? Like the research, if you tell them all the research, do they oh, I'm wrong, you're right, I understand that now? Do people very easily to be convinced and then drop their anxiety?
It's kind of a complicated message. It's a little bit almost sort of contradictory. There's kind of a dialectic or kind of fusion between these two separate ideas, where the good news is you're probably getting more sleep than you feel like you should be getting. But on the other hand, it's not the kind of sleep that you wish you were getting. So kind of that good news, bad news sort of thing, and not dismissing people's concerns, because their experiences, somebody's experience is not something you can really argue with. And kind of being able to I found that pretty much everybody I've worked with, we're able to, when this is an issue, we're able to get on the same page about, okay, you're actually probably in and out. That's why, I believe that it feels like that. So really kind of coming alongside rather than trying to convince somebody of something that doesn't really fit with their experience, but kind of coming to a common understanding and then being able to work from there, especially when you're talking about, instructions like, oh, if you're awake for a long time, get out of bed. And well, I don't know if I was awake or asleep. Okay, then what do you do about that? And kind of coming up with a plan that is actually something that can work for somebody who really isn't very sure about when they're awake or asleep. And that even that process can be a learning experience of okay, now I'm paying more attention to when I'm awake or asleep, and putting into practice a behavioral intervention that's sort of based on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good to know. And I like your approach to really validate people's experience, acknowledge they are suffering and they are experiencing this and they are not comfortable, but at the same time, help them understand the mechanism, the science behind it. And sounds like, they may have a not so good experience of sleep at night. It possibly not this type of the good sleep quality they want to get. It's not ideal, but it's also not the end of the world. And there's always some hope there. There's some room to work on there. What we just talked about was how you get into the field. You research quite a lot in those, which is awesome, which is very important topic for people to understand, and sounds quite complicated. And then what are some current research projects you're doing?
One of the most recent ones that was actually just published was one where we were developing a new treatment. This was something that was led by Jason Ong, who was my postdoctoral mentor, and I was on as a co-investigator. The idea was to develop a treatment for folks who have hypersomnia, so either narcolepsy type 1, narcolepsy type 2, or idiopathic hypersomnia. That's what we were focusing on in the study. It's really kind of a big shift in terms of mindset to approach as a behavioral sleep medicine expert, and that the majority of our work tends to be in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is a treatment that works really well, works better than sleeping pills. People get off sleeping pills, and the only treatment that they need is CBTI, and it's just very quick. People come in, they get better, and they go and live their life. And usually, that's the idea is that people no longer have to even think about having insomnia. They may be not perfect sleepers, but they sleep well enough, and they function pretty well during the day, and it's really not a big deal anymore. Somebody with a hypersomnia disorder, though, it's a medical disorder. It's something that really still does require at this point some sort of medication, usually something like a stimulant medication during the daytime. Maybe something at night as well. It sort of depends on the specific problem and the individual. And one of the big issues with this is that physicians in general are really not well educated on being able to recognize these disorders, which is, again, it's really understandable. A primary care physician has to be able to understand all of medicine, and they maybe get half an hour on sleep during their training, and a lot of that is focused on sleep disordered breathing, which makes sense because that's the most common. That and insomnia, those are the two most common sleep disorders, and so primary care is really on the front lines of treating a lot of insomnia and trying to identify folks who have sleep apnea. And for sleep apnea, they have to refer them on. But what that means is that a lot of folks who have hypersomnia disorders don't get picked up. They don't have that disorder identified very quickly at all. So they end up being diagnosed maybe with depression, or told nothing is wrong, or other sorts of explanations that aren't really a good fit. And then the treatments don't work for those problems because it's not what's going on for them. And it can end up having a profound effect on people's lives. Just by the effect of the symptoms is pretty disabling. And then people then very understandably personalize these symptoms. And it's, okay, well, maybe I'm just a lazy person. And maybe they're getting that message explicitly from people in their lives. You're sleeping all the time. You must be lazy. Why aren't you getting up? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? You're just lazy. And so for a little while, you can maybe see that, okay, well, maybe you kind of withstand that for a little bit. But when you don't have any other explanations, this is going on for years. The average time for a person with narcolepsy to get diagnosed is about 7 years. It's a long time to be living with an undiagnosed, untreated, and pretty serious sleep problem. And then that really just can change people's self-image, how they see themselves, their self-esteem. People have to change their plans pretty substantially in terms of maybe they drop out of school, maybe they're not able to work, maybe they're not able to maintain relationships. And this all becomes very sort of personal. It's about who I am, not about this problem. So the good news is that people do, eventually, get diagnosed, they get an answer, and they can, okay, well, it's not me, but you've already had now years and years of kind of repetition of this idea that it's me, it's something about me that's, that makes that I'm a bad person or I'm lazy. Getting a different answer is helpful, but it's not really panacea. It doesn't make a person think, oh, well, oh, no, everything's all good. I feel great about myself. Because also that period of not being diagnosed or treated, or having their symptoms totally unmanaged, can have real effects on a person's life that they're now having to live with.
Right. Yeah, what you just mentioned totally with some other guests I invited on the show earlier, they themselves has either narcolepsy, or I seen people in my clinical setting, right, who has sounds like very obvious this kind of hypersomnia symptom, but they never got diagnosed. But instead, they were diagnosed with psychiatric disorders. And of course, the treatment did not work. And they have to consult different professionals. And eventually, after years, led to some kind of direction. Oh, maybe we should do a certain type of testing, a sleep study, and other things to really figure this out to get diagnosed. But they also definitely mentioned the same thing to me, that after the diagnosis, it's kind of like the start. Finally, they are not walking in the darkness. There's a explanation for their symptoms, their struggles, but then what? So a lot of people ask me, or themselves been wondering, is that only medication can help them, right? Is there any behavioral strategy or what psychologists can do to them? Is there anything? So that's what I want to hear from you more. Like, is that only medication, the only answer for the rest of their life? What else can we do?
Yeah. That's sort of the question, because now if a person has gotten a diagnosis, that means they've actually been able to meet and be evaluated by somebody who is an expert in sleep disorders. So now they have somebody, okay, now this person understands my sleep problem, but this person doesn't really have the time to spend helping me with the sort of the broader context of living with hypersomnia. So there's sorts of problems that are more in the psychosocial domain. So their sleep doctor can help with this sort of managing their sleep disorder with medications and managing their symptoms, which is really kind of also kind of a struggle, where a lot of times the medications are helpful, but they don't totally sort of bring a person back to what we consider to be normal, or what their ideal would be. And then sometimes some of the medications have side effects that can limit their ability to use to engage with those treatments. So that's kind of its own challenge. And so, okay, well, what about all these, sort of broader effects on my life? And so the sort of obvious answer to that is to see a therapist. Unfortunately, the majority of therapists have, similar to like what I was saying about primary care, they don't get a lot of training in sleep disorders. And so that becomes sort of issue of, well, my sleep doctor, understands my sleep disorder, but, can't help me with the psychosocial issues. And then, I talk to a therapist, they don't know anything about my sleep disorder. So they think that maybe they think it's depression or something like that, that is only that. And that becomes kind of a tough spot to be in. That was really kind of the, what led to developing this treatment. So it sort of has a number of different pieces included. And one of the things that was interesting too was that we tried doing it as individual treatment, and also doing it in groups. And doing it in groups, a lot of these folks have not met another person who has the same sort of problem, not met another person with hypersomnia. And so there's some organizations like Narcolepsy Network, for example, where people can go and they can meet other people with narcolepsy. In that case, it's another sort of revelation where it's like, oh, there are other people who are like me, which can be helpful. But then there are other pieces like just generally just from the start, just getting better education on what hypersomnia is. Even if you have that opportunity to get a diagnosis, that usually can be a pretty brief visit and maybe doesn't answer all the questions or provide all the information, or it's hard to take in. So that's one of the sort of very simple, concrete things that we can talk about to kind of help kind of better understand what's going on. Again, with some of the sort of concrete stuff is working on issues around managing sleep and wake and time. So like with CBTI, we focus a lot on the sleep diary, which is exclusively focused on the nighttime. But for a person with hypersomnia, we're not really as concerned with the nighttime. Although, some folks, especially folks with narcolepsy type 1, can have pretty disrupted sleep at night. What we're focused on primarily is what people are doing during the daytime, and getting a picture of where that time is going, and are there ways to, for example, build in structured naps or breaks that may or may not be helpful. Some folks, especially folks with like type 1 narcolepsy, can find a brief nap to be very restoring, whereas some other folks who maybe have type 2 narcolepsy or idiopathic hypersomnia, if they take a nap, they're not getting back up. They can have pretty substantial, especially folks with IH, they can have pretty substantial sleep inertia when they wake up, and it's very disorienting, very confusing. It feels really bad. But being able to take a look at things that way, one of the things we talk about is the Pomodoro Technique. So taking a whole day and kind of break it into pieces as something that's a way to make the most out of the energy that you do have. That's kind of the more sort of concrete part, but in a sort of complementary fashion, one of the things we look at is, what are the things a person is doing with their daytime? These different activities and things that people are engaged in, are these things that are nurturing, that build their energy, or are they things that are just very depleting? And really taking a look at that balance, because even a person who has hypersomnia, you add on a bunch of really depleting activities, that makes the problem worse. It doesn't mean that that your sleep disorder is the only thing that can make you feel more energized or more depleted or good or bad. There are other things, there are other layers that are on top of that are worth taking a look at. Things like depression symptoms. So, and addressing those with things like behavioral activation. So doing things that are meaningful, that make you feel either just good or just fun, they're just pleasurable, or give you that sense of meaning, of purpose, of accomplishment, that's kind of at that other level that can help you feel more like the person you want to be, can be helpful as well.
I really love this approach. Feels like they combine a lot of psychological component in it, and also help with the medical team, like really a collaborative approach. Feels like, I know the psychoeducation piece is always important, even for people with insomnia. And I'm sure for hypersomnia, possibly more important, the patients and their family members possibly all need to know more about that, because we don't really talk about that as much. And people all know I cannot sleep, but people don't know what that means if I have this hypersomnia symptoms. And I always think psychoeducation as something like, if we know more about that, it's less scary. We possibly won't feel that much anxiety about it. And this association, social support piece, a lot of my previous guests also talk about that when they are diagnosed as narcolepsy themselves or other hypersomnia symptoms, they find this support groups. It's really helped them. And they learn different strategies to manage that, like sounds like lifestyle shift, right? Can be really important. It's part of the picture. And some of them even start telling their stories and organize this kind of support group themselves. That's what you mentioned, make life more meaningful, and how to find a way to still be optimistic and move on with life. So I really love this approach you guys put in this treatment method.
Yeah. We're pretty feel pretty good about it. People seem to like the treatment. One of the things that was interesting was we did this last year. So I think all the treatment was delivered. I think all the treatment was delivered last year. So all pre-COVID, but we did everything by teleconference. So all the recruitment, all the treatment, all the screening, all of the assessment measures were collected online. And so this allowed us to meet our recruitment goals really quickly, which is always often a challenge, but but being able to recruit not just from the Chicago area, but being able to recruit from the entire country was a big help. And also working with some of these organizations who are really see the need for something like this, and then they can then kind of reach out to their membership, and that allowed us to get more people in. So that was helpful. And then folks who have a serious sleep disorder like hypersomnia, the ability to engage in treatment or therapy from the home is just a huge help for folks.
Yeah, especially after COVID. And I
Mm.
think next year, possibly a lot of people still gonna have to stay at home receiving whatever treatment. So this is perfect that you guys deliver that through telehealth
Hmm.
platform already.
Yeah. Yeah. I was really, I didn't know how much of a preview it was going to be of 2020, but it ended up being a good experience in and of itself, and then also helpful for me personally to already have some comfort with kind of working in that way. Yeah, and then the people, they like the format. They like, not having to go anywhere. Yeah, it's just kind of also, I feel like a better way to be able to put people together. Both narcolepsy and idiopathic hypersomnia are relatively rare disorders. Not that nobody has them, but I think narcolepsy is about as common as multiple sclerosis, and far less common than insomnia. So if you want to have a treatment that's delivered in a group setting, it's nice to be able to have a larger pool to draw from,
Yeah.
to be able to bring people together, and people really like that. So yeah, it was nice. And then we saw also, improvements in depression symptoms. And the thing that really stood out the most was self-efficacy. So just a general measure that we use. It was, what's your sort of confidence in your ability to handle things in your life? Just really broad, just broadly defined, not what is your symptom of depression or anxiety or whatever, very, very specific. But do you feel like you have the ability to handle the things in your life and things that come your way and problems that come up? Do you feel like you can handle those? And that's where we saw the biggest improvement, which to me, I feel is really good, because I feel it's like, okay, people feel like they're better able to manage their life. We're not expecting for people's, hypersomnia symptoms to change a lot, because we're not directly treating those. We're more interested in, can we help people, live their life and feel like they can do that in a meaningful way. So that was nice to see.
Yeah, great. So do you, in your own practice, do you deliver this kind of treatment to people like individually or in group format or both?
Yeah, so my practice is still pretty early in terms of its development, and also happening, during COVID is a little bit kind of its own sort of challenge. So the majority of folks I've been working with have been, like any other person who's doing behavioral sleep medicine, have been folks with insomnia. And also just in terms of, being able to get the word out there that that this is a resource that's available, that actually, even just the idea that insomnia can be treated with something other than a medication, and that's actually the first line treatment. That's kind of a thing that people don't always know. All that to say, everybody I've worked with so far has been individually. And it's one of the things that I don't think is ever going to go away, is people either wanting or needing one-on-one treatment. So as we think about, bigger scale issues about like how common insomnia is, how many millions of people have insomnia, and how do we get them all treated in a way that's effective, and giving them the first line treatment is a challenge. And even with as much work as is going on in terms of things like step care models, automated online or digital treatments, or moving to like group-based treatments or very brief treatments that can be delivered in primary care, that have been shown to be effective. At the end of the day, effective in a research study doesn't mean that it's going to be effective for every single person who has the problem.
True. Yeah, those digital online platform you mentioned, do you use any of them or do you recommend any of them to some patients? I think a lot of people still prefer this kind of one-on-one with a real professional to help them tailor the treatment. But I know there are other platforms, very standard, like different modules, right? Just go over that on your own pace and then you will be fine. There are also like trackers we can wear to monitor the sleep. So I'm wondering, do you use that in your practice, or what's your view about them?
I think there are some things out there that are really effective. And even before we had, things that were digital online, we had books. We've had books for decades that have really good information, are written by experts in the field. Websites are nice because they're interactive, and you can, I think, input your like sleep diary information, have it calculate things for you, and maybe give you a little bit in terms of personalized recommendations. But all these things require that you are very active and very engaged, and really doing it yourself. So a lot of people, that's great. They can totally take that on. They can do that. They can make it happen. It's like anything else. It's like taking on a new diet or exercise program or something like that. Some people you can just say, here, read this book, read this pamphlet, like this is your information, and people can take that and they're like, oh, this makes sense. I can totally do this. Other people are going to need a little bit more support, or it won't make sense, or it might not be a good fit for them. And so it needs to, have a little bit more interaction from just a little bit to kind of a lot in terms of, kind of use the analogy of like exercise or sports, having a coach who can say, okay, actually you kind of need to tweak this. Like I understand how like the instructions said A, you did B, but it's not really like, I can see how you made that jump there, but we kind of need to change a little bit of your approach in a way that's a book certainly can't do. Right. A digital platform. It depends on the specific issue. Some may be able to handle it all right, but others not really. And that's one of the things too is, really in any sort of therapeutic context, there's always been a emphasis in all of my training and all on having a good rapport, having a good relationship with the individual, and that being really pretty important for getting some amount of therapeutic change. If you're talking to somebody about doing something that's really hard or maybe doesn't make a lot of sense, it's a lot different when you're discussing doing something difficult with somebody who you trust and feel you have a good relationship with, as opposed to some just website that it's not a person, it's just automated, it doesn't understand me. So a lot of that piece is missing. I think that probably all of them that are really out there are either they have research showing they work, or they're based on solid principles. It's not that they won't work, it's just that change is hard, and having a person there with you, I think, is going to make a difference for folks, kind of always and forever. And being able to personalize treatment, using something like a case conceptualization model where you can take a look and see like, okay, these are the issues that are specific to this person. How am I going to approach that with this person? That might be different than just a standard, session by session protocol. And a lot of people do insomnia treatment that way. A lot of individual people do it that way. And that's, again, it's something that can be effective, but whenever you have a real person that's working one-on-one with you, you can always have the opportunity to ask more questions, to do personalized treatment, that sort of thing. So I think a lot of these things are going to be really helpful, and get the word out about CBTI. And I think, understandably, there's going to be a lot of folks who benefit from it, but also a lot of folks who find that it just isn't the right thing for them, that it's not able to help them in the way that they need. So I think it's going to end up being win-win for patients and for people who are behavioral sleep medicine providers who are doing things like CBTI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I totally agree. I think even when I was in training, I shadowed my professor, and sometime a day there are going to be 8-ish insomnia patients. Even though they all have symptoms of insomnia, possibly they all cannot fall asleep easily, but it's really different. The reason behind it, the sleep habits, and what they've been trying, what they are doing, what the reasons, it's so different from person to person. So I think standard resources are out there to help more people know about it. It's great, but this professional training, like people like you provide this kind of service to be able to tailor it to each person's need, is equally important. So people, whoever is listening, they can just really pick and choose what's the best to fit their needs.
Yeah, totally. And also these things they vary in terms of their accessibility and cost. Probably the most expensive, least accessible thing is working with somebody one-on-one, especially depending on your area. There might not be somebody who's in your area who has the expertise, or it might be something like in the Bay Area. I know a lot of folks who do CBTI who aren't part of a healthcare system. If they're independent, they charge a lot. They're very expensive.
Yeah.
So, I had somebody reach out to me from California who said, "Oh, well, you're in Indiana. Like, can you treat me?" your rates are lower. So, a book is really cheap. There are good books that, are solid. A lot of the stuff in terms of insomnia treatment hasn't changed that much. And so you can buy a used book on Amazon. I have like $10.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you're able to implement it, that's great. And then, some of the web stuff, it could be cheaper. It could be, end up being, the same cost of meeting with me once to do a whole treatment program. Yeah, just one of the other things that sort of crossed my mind about this is that when a problem comes up, like sleep discrepancy, when somebody comes in and their sleep diary shows that they haven't slept at all, or it's not even filled out, or whatever, there's a question: what do you do with that? And I don't know how those systems handle that.
Right.
Maybe they have a great way. I'm not really sure, but for me, that's a moment for me to like pause, take a step back, have a conversation, think about how can we move forward. Because some of the treatment approaches that we use are really need that data, but if a person's really not sure about what's going on, you need it, like that particular intervention isn't going to work. So I tend to go in another direction, just because essentially one door is kind of closed. So trying to keep working on that is not something that's likely to be helpful for the person who's there to get help.
Right. That's such a good point. Yeah, that's kind of one-on-one treatment can really help with that. And there's a lot of things without data, right? How a program can handle it and how an expert can handle it. So at the end of the show, is there any last wisdom you want to share with all the audience if people are listening or really have some kind of sleep-related struggles or confused about that?
Yeah, I think, overall, the message I'd like to send is that if things are hard right now, they don't need to be, that there's hope, that we have good treatments. There are just so many different options. If you're struggling, it doesn't have to be like that.
So carry the hope.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. Awesome. So Dr. Johnson, if any of our listeners really want to seek your professional help, they want to, go to your practice to receive treatment from you, how can they find you?
Yeah, so my website for my practice is bettersleepbloomington.com. That's where I'm based out of, is Bloomington, Indiana. I'm licensed in Indiana. With the pandemic, there is a little bit of changes in terms of how states are allowing folks who are licensed in one state to practice in another. That varies state by state. I'm also happy to, if folks are interested, to point them in helpful directions, even if I'm not able to see them personally.
Great. So sounds like during the pandemic, if people from other states, they really want to get your service, they possibly can still contact you, see whether their their state can still get your help, or you can help them link to other resources.
Exactly.
Cool. I will put your website and the published paper you talk about and other resources to the show notes, so people will be able to directly click through your website. Thank you very much for coming to the show today.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So that's my conversation with Dr. Johnson. What did you learn? Leave me a message, let me know. So if you want to find more about Dr. Johnson's private practice, you can go to his website at bettersleepbloomington.com. I will also put his information on my website at deepintosleep.co. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.
Sleep is an individual thing. We all sleep differently, and there is so much we can do to improve sleep quality. Keep hope and carry on. This podcast is for general informational purpose only and does not include the practice of medicine or other health professional services. Usage of the information we share is at the listener's own risk, and our content does not intend to be a substitute for any medical and professional services, diagnoses, and treatment. Please seek professional health services as needed.